we went to see AMD, and just before I flew out to Gamescom, there was a pre-brief on what they were going to be announcing at Gamescom. But we actually went into this meeting unaware of what was in the pre-brief. I think Will sent us a few snaps and some highlights, actually.
I was honestly shocked when we opened the door and they had a baseball bat with an AMD logo on it like this. And then, thankfully, they just wanted to show it to us.
I forgot about the baseball bat.
Yeah.
Wow.
Trauma does that to you, right?
But it was a fascinating meeting because FSR 3 has broken cover, and we've seen it. We've been eyes on, not hands on. We've seen 2 implementations of it: Immortals of Avium and Sporfoken rather.
The classic
Sporfoken. And first impressions are actually extremely impressive to the point. Well, it was a curated series of demos. We weren't allowed to go hands-on, so we couldn't get a feel for it. Right, we couldn't really feel for latency and stuff. And there are a few things that we asked them to show us that they didn't want to show us, which was perhaps understandable, but even so, the general perception of FSR 3, I would say, is based on this demo and with a lack of head-to-head comparisons. I would say it was extremely impressive and job done, really.
Compelling demo, yeah. So in Forspoken, there's an area that they showed it off in where, for the demos, just to talk about some of the conditions of the demo. In Forspoken, it was done with VSync on the panel on, and with the game being frame limited to an output post everything 120 FPS.
Yeah.
And that gave a very fluid impression, to say the least. It looked really good. We saw the game without it on. We saw also the game with it on, as well as with the new, I think we can talk about it, FSR 2 AA mode, essentially.
Yes, yeah, that's right.
Essentially their answer to what DLAA is and what has it become.
What did they call that?
God, it's like FSR native?
Yeah,
FSR native.
Native AA.
Native AA or something like that, yeah.
Which is essentially FSR 2 running at native resolution, similar to the way DLAA works.
Yeah.
So it's pure anti-aliasing, temporal supersampling there. And we first saw it, of course, in Red Dead Redemption on PlayStation 4.
Yes.
Which kind of they
were kind of like
was that meant to happen?
No.
Well, you could have always technically done it in the past with their SDK even, but it's just not like, it's like how you could have done it with DLSS as well, but it wasn't recommended.
No, because it wasn't really designed for that.
Yeah, it wasn't designed around this necessarily. And this was. And so that looked good itself too, but that's obviously, once again, this is like we were behind the screen. We're not like looking up there just staring at pixels, but we know what it kind of looks like in Red Dead. But to get back to FSR 3, we saw it in that demo running at a clipped 120 FPS with VSync on, and they were and we talked to Nick Tibiros about this, and he was very adamant about it. Once his personal preferences for using VSync in general, but it also seems like they want to focus it around essentially the usage of VSync for frame pacing That's the way he kind of said it to us. Like, I want to have VSync on here to have the frames be paced.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, there was a little meter in the top right-hand corner which was showing VSync, right?
It was showing VSync, full VSync. And then we saw it in we can talk about the quality there in a second, but we also saw it in Immortals of Avium, where there it was shown in a different manner, where the game was running at a I think it was FSR 2 quality mode originally, what was shown off in, and then that turned on, and that wasn't due to there's differences obviously between the games. Forspoken, on the rig they had it on, was like a 7900 XTX with probably a 7800 X3D. Right?
I think that was the case, yes.
Yeah. And so in Forspoken, no issues of hitting that 120 FPS line. But in Immortals of Avium, due to the game being so CPU limited, there was different scaling that was shown off.
Big time, yep.
And so it wasn't like a full 120. And this is where the one part of the demo that I was a little confused by, and this is why we need hands-on about it, where they were showing it with VSync on, but the monitors they were showing it on we asked about it, they were 144 hertz FreeSync monitors, but it didn't look like FreeSync was doing the normal FreeSync thing of smoothing out frames in their delivery and not delivering them within the vertical sync window. But it wasn't like, it didn't look like it was adjusting refresh rate.
No, it basically looked like it was playing with the VSync enabled on a non-VRR panel.
That's what it
So you
looked
get
like
that
to
sort
me.
of like judder.
You were asking for strafing motions.
Yeah.
But there was but Immortals is tough, and I think it was a mix of things. But there was also like the geometry caused the viewport to sort of jiggle a little bit in spots. But we also got evidence where we could look at it without that issue, and you could see there was some frame time inconsistencies that were a little bit odd. But
but it's really hard to know what that
We don't-
was.
but if you use
Quality
the,
wise,
if you use the default DLSS 3 too, like without VSync, like it is by default, it doesn't look great either. So it remains to be seen how the stuff actually pans out once we get it into our own hands, right?
quality-wise, I don't think there are any complaints based on the presentation we saw. It looked good. And we actually got some insights into how they're doing it, because obviously NVIDIA is using the optical flow analyzer. It's a hardware solution.
Right.
What they seem to be doing, correct me if I'm wrong, Alex, is for AMD, they're basically making it into an async task, putting it on the async pipeline, and then basically the amount of time taken to process the optical flow is dependent on how much the game is using async compute.
Yeah, it's variable per frame. They showed it on a 7900 XTX. It has extra processing time, over FSR2, because FSR2 is the upscale. If you want to use it, you don't have to use it. And then FSR3 is a compute shader running on the GPU, hopefully on the async queue, so it can have its cost be hidden to a certain degree based upon how much is already in that async queue. And it's going to be very game dependent, because some games, and on some GPUs, you could have none of that time there, or you could have an extreme amount of time there. And that kind of brings the idea that you were just saying, like, it's a compute shader. It is not running on like dedicated hardware like we see on Ada, Lovelace. And this makes it IHV cross-compatible. It can run on Intel. It can run on NVIDIA.
Yeah, that's going to be fascinating. But we should talk about latency, because...
Well, first, Rich, before we get to that, you were talking image quality first. We didn't mention the fact that they actually separate out the UI stuff in these games.
Yeah, that's pretty crucial. Obviously,
That was a key thing, right?
Yeah, DLSS 3, when it launched, there wasn't that HUD separation, so you had that ghosting on every other frame. This was perfectly clean, right?
Yeah, it was good. I mean, we didn't see any, so there's different types of ghosting, obviously. We saw in Immortals of Avium, for example, they only have static screen elements. You know what I mean? Like they're tasked to like one part of the screen. We didn't see like an objective marker that moves with the 3D camera. And that's something we didn't see, and that's like another thing. But yeah, you can maybe talk about some of the modes. Like he described 3 different types of modes, if you recall.
Oh, I can't remember all the details. There was
there was a mode that just updated every other frame.
Yes.
Right.
Yes, and it blanked the HUD, so you'd get like a 60 hertz strobe of the HUD.
Right, so the HUD, so if you were getting 120 FPS with FSR3, the HUD would update at 60 perceptually, right? So there's that. Then there was another mode where they're essentially rendering the HUD layer separate and compositing it at the end, I think it is, so that it's not actually factored into any of the interpolation of frames.
Very true. And then
what was the third one?
Then the other one was actually native HUD rendering mode.
Oh, right.
Where that would be on the CPU, essentially updating as if it were the real end frame rate. And so you'd have a native, like let's just say you're like FSR3 up to 120 FPS. That would be, the HUD is a real native 120 FPS. And that is an option. Obviously, these are 3 options that are given to developers. And the idea there is, if your HUD is light enough, this could be a great way to get like a super native looking experience there without any HUD interpolation issues. But that doesn't fit every game. Like a ton of games use like Scaleform, and they like are super slow. It's like Flash. It's like, it can't work for every game. But
Yeah, I mean, the thing that they didn't talk about much was latency mitigation, because that's going to be done, I suspect, at the driver level or with an SDK component, which they're calling Anti-Lag Plus, which they didn't want to talk about.
Yeah, we didn't talk about it with us.
So, yeah, basically, the price, I guess, of it being cross-vendor, it will work on any GPU, right? It will work on consoles, actually. We'll talk about that shortly.
Yeah, that's key.
Is that, basically, if it's not within the AMD ecosystem or I don't know how it's going to work with reflex if the game is reflex supported but doesn't.
You can turn on reflex no matter what
Yeah.
in any game, so I don't know.
So yeah, they weren't talking about that, and but that, you know, I assume on the Intel side of things there would be no latency mitigation because they, yeah. But it is cross-vendor. Actually, I'm going to take this question from supporter Dajar Ko. There's a big rumor circulating that AMD will be launching FSR 3 with a competing frame generation implementation alongside the launch of Starfield. This begs the question, will it enable a quote-unquote sensible 40 FPS mode on console? Which is kind of like, we can't really talk about Starfield at all.
Well, Rich, actually, we can mention the fact that they did show us a slide of publishers and games that are going to be supported. Starfield wasn't on the list, which actually surprises me because they are obviously a big partner for it, right?
Yeah.
You would have expected that to be one of the major titles to support this at launch.
I
don't know what's up with that.
Okay.
Maybe it'll come later, though.
That was weird. I didn't know.
Yeah, the sensible 40 FPS mode, I don't think it's really compatible with this type of technology.
No,
not at all.
They even said they want the game to be at 60 internally before they even touch FSR 3.
Before frame generation, yeah.
Which is true of DLSS 3, of course.
Not
entirely.
It depends on the content.
I mean, talking with NVIDIA themselves, they were not saying that. They were saying
They were saying
internally, like, we're fine if the game is 80 FPS with DLSS 3, and they were confident of the quality there. That was a different thing, and we've talked about this before in our other videos, but it's very game content dependent, like how effective an up conversion from 30 to 60 is, or 40 to 80, etc. So
okay.
Yeah, but consoles, it can run on consoles.
That's right. We just asked them point blank, and they're like, "Yep, it's designed to work on RDNA 1 up, I believe."
Yeah, but this is the thing. So that time that they mentioned of the milliseconds per frame that it will cost over, even with async, it could, on a 7900 XTX, it could be like, I think it was like 1.7 or something like that. He said,
sure,
it was some number. It was a number that was like around 2-ish. There was a cost, and there was a cost that was a 7900 XTX. It's a big GPU. So bringing that down, even Nick said to us, Nick Tibidos, he's like, yeah, you can run this on a console, but at some point in time, it is maybe not actually a super beneficial thing for experience. For the player experience.
But I think lighter games that are perhaps able to get to 60 fairly easily, but couldn't hit 120, for instance, this would be a good way to get that 120 FPS experience on a console.
Yeah,
if it was light enough where...
Yeah. It's hard to know because if it's like almost 2 ms on like a 7900 XTX, it could be like 4 ms on like a PS5, and that's like half of your frame time already at 120. I don't actually know how doable that is, honestly.
We'll just see.
We'll have to see, obviously, but I'm a little skeptical about that at the first part now, because like when we always talked about like Nintendo Switch 2 and DLSS 3, I was always like, frame time is really important. We can't just say it runs there, so. I'm just managing expectations.
I'm sure there will be people were going to be using it just as they used FSR2. They were talking also about the inputs for FSR3 being the optical flow and the motion vectors from FSR2. It looks as though they've got some good support lined up there on the titles. And
not Starfield though.
Who knows about that? But Immortals, and I guess if and when this comes out soon enough, I'm really busy, but it's Immortals of Avium also has DLSS 3, currently not working as of launch, but that is an obvious comparison point. And I got like those like 6 points of like where I saw issues with DLSS 3, and I'm gonna try and run them at least in Forspoken and Immortals of Avium if the time's there.
Yeah, well, there's no DLSS 3 in Forspoken, so analysis versus DLSS 3 would have to be versus Immortals.
Which is a first-person game, and that's obviously different. So.
Okay, yeah, but basically that was a really pleasant start to the meeting, right? Because it was basically playing out right in front of us, not any trailers or videos or anything like that.
Nick was controlling it all, showing
hands-on
demo.
off. We asked questions, we got frank, open answers.
Impressively so, I would say. They were really honest and open about it. And
curious about what we had to say,
too. Absolutely. Yeah, it was a really, really positive start to the meeting. But yeah, that's everything we've got to say about FSR3 at the moment. Based on the demos that we saw, I'd say it's really, really positive. There's still question marks over the specific form of latency reduction mitigation that AMD is planning, but they are planning it, I think is fair to say. Yes. So yeah, that's going to be really interesting.
They did note, did we mention that anti-lag plus is something that only runs on AMD cards?
Yeah.
They did specify that, so.
Yeah, and I just actually had a little thought about it. They mentioned that FSR3 takes control of the swap chain, which is what Reflex would do. So I think they would actually maybe conflict with each other. So you would have to choose one or the other. I was just thinking about this in my head.
Right.
Because that Reflex is taking control of the swap chain, so.
That's true.
Okay.
All right.
FSR3 coming soon, they said. We're expecting something hopefully soon, next month. Let's see.
We hope that FSR3 is as hot as this room.